So at this point, we'll begin to turn our discussion towards the idea of pitch. Now, we've been talking about pitches and notes in the context of our discussions on clefs and accidentals, but now we'll start to deal with them a little bit more directly. Just as a matter of framing our discussion, I want to point out that we are talking about pitch in the context of Western style or Western notation and kind of pitch identities and those kinds of things, with the recognition that there are many other kinds of pitch systems globally. So I just want to make sure that we're clear that we're talking about pitch systems unique to Western music or Western influenced music. So within the Western pitch system, we kind of define human audible sounds from low to high in terms of octaves or registers. And within each octave, there are 12 unique pitches, or what we sometimes call pitch classes, that have a characteristic sound. So let's take, for example, above middle C on the piano, the note A. So the unique characteristics about that sound that lead us to call it an A has to do with the frequency of the pitch, or the rate at which the sound waves move through air. So in the United States, we refer to a frequency of 440 hertz or sound waves per second as constituting what we consider to be an A. So just as a side note, this idea of A being 440 hertz is kind of a thing that's unique to our practice here in the United States. In other places such as Europe, for example, the A can be as high as 444 hertz and a few other variations in there as well. So as I stated before, these pitch classes are represented across multiple registers or multiple what we call octaves. So to take that A as an example, if I were to double the frequency, if I were to have sound waves travel at twice that speed of 440 to 880 hertz, I would end up with this sound. Which, because it shares that similarity to the A I had before, I call this an A as well. This is an A that is an octave higher than the A above middle C. By the way, just for reference, the A above middle C we sometimes call A4, and so an octave higher than that would be A5. So that 2-to-1 ratio is important to explaining how the same note at different octave kind of appears. So if I were to take that A440 and go down an octave to A3 or A below middle C, well, let's listen to that. Now what I've done in this case, just as I doubled the 440 hertz to get to an octave above the A above middle C, well, to get to an octave below that note, I'm going to take that 440 and cut it in half to 220 hertz. So those frequencies and either taking them and doubling them or cutting them in half, that is what gives us all of our A's. And similar things could be said for all of the other pitches or pitch classes that each vibrate at unique defined frequencies. So calling the pitch that represents 440 vibrations per second an A is one example of how we assign letter names to different pitch classes. In fact, we assign letter names using the first 7 letters of the alphabet, as I briefly mentioned in our clefs video. So A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. But of course, remember I said that we have a 12-pitch system, a 12-pitch class system, but I've only used 7 notes. Well, that's where our accidentals come in. So that kind of ties in that part of the conversation. There are notes between these lettered notes that we can call sharps and flats and all the things we talked about in our discussion of accidentals. As I also mentioned in the accidentals video, each of the notes that we have in our pitch system can go by multiple names. That's when we start talking about, for example, the fact that a G sharp is also known as an A flat, right? That the note B can also be a C flat. Well, we actually have a term for that. We use the word enharmonic to talk about the phenomenon whereby a given pitch can go by multiple different names. So that C flat is enharmonically equivalent to B. In other words, same pitch, different names. So of course we'll want to talk about how to actually write these pitches down on the staff, some of which we've already shown examples of when we talk about clefs and accidentals, but let's look at it in a little bit more focused way here. So as we mentioned before, the notes alternate between lines and spaces as they're represented on a staff. Their relative pitch, in terms of being a higher pitch or a lower pitch, is mirrored by how high or low they're written on the staff. And in terms of the note names, as we've mentioned before, as we go up in pitch, we go forward in the alphabet, and we mirror that by gradually climbing, alternating between lines and spaces on the staff. Similarly, to go down in pitch, we go backwards through the alphabet, again, still alternating between lines and spaces. When we want multiple notes to sound together, we'll represent that in written music by having all of those notes align vertically. When we have a series of notes that occur in sequential order, as in a melody, well, then we tend to write those horizontally, and we write them from left to right as the notes occur. When we talk about the interactions among notes that happen at the same time, we are usually talking about harmonic activity. When we talk about the relationships among notes that appear in sequential order or in chronological order, we're talking about melodic activity. So as we talk about how to identify or write any given pitch on the staff, it's really useful to refer back to our conversation on clefs, especially thinking about the nicknames that we've assigned to the clefs. We have the G clef that refers to the treble clef, the C clef, which can be represented as an alto clef or a tenor clef, and some others, but those are the two we'll focus on here. And then also the F clef, which refers to the bass clef. So thinking about those G's, those C's, those F's, those can be really useful reference points for figuring out any other note. If you proceed through the clef alphabetically as you ascend or reverse alphabetically as you descend, you can use those points, those notes that are identified by the clef, as starting points to figure out any other note. Now, the case may be that you're already very familiar with the notes as they appear on at least one or maybe two clefs, but I recommend that for the clefs that you might not be as strong on, you go ahead and use that either C, G, or F as a reference point, but also pick one or two notes in each range of kind of the staff, so to speak. So for each clef, find places in the lower part of the staff, in the middle area of the staff, and in the high part of the staff. Just kind of let yourself memorize those few notes, and that'll make your identification go a little bit faster because you'll have multiple reference points rather than just one. I just want to kind of clarify something with respect to note names that involve accidentals. It's just a bit of convention here that when we are writing the letters out, right? So if we take the letter F and talk about F as being a part of an F sharp, the sharp, whether you spell the word out or use the symbol, appears after the letter. And that is backwards from the way we write the notes down in notation. So to take the note F sharp and write it down on the staff, well, we would have the sharp come just before the actual note head.